Thank you everyone for joining our virtual panel on demystifying this new budget model that CSU is transitioning to. It's called RCM, Responsibility Center Management. If you are unsure of what that is, don't worry, we'll go over all of that. But I want to first and foremost thank CSU AAUP for organizing and putting this on. Note that this will go until 5:15 Mountain Time. So to give you an idea, it's about 75 minutes. For those of you who aren't on the panel, could you please turn off your camera and mute yourself to minimize distractions so we could focus on the panelists? And note that also, as you probably saw, that this is being recorded. Okay, so we'll do introductions first. So I'll go. My name is Andrew Du. I am assistant professor in the Department of Anthropology and Geography here at CSU, and I am a member of the AAUP executive committee. And so Jeffrey, if you could introduce yourself next.
Sure, thanks for inviting me. My name is Jeff Doshna. I am associate professor of city planning and community development at Temple University. I'm also the president of TAUP, the Temple Association of University Professionals, which was once upon a time an AAUP chapter back when we started in '73, and have been an AFT local since the mid '80s. And again, thanks for the invite.
Andrew?
Hi, Andrew Goldstone, Associate Professor of English at Rutgers University, New Brunswick in New Jersey. And I'm a rank and file member of the Rutgers AAUP-AFT, which is both our AAUP chapter and our faculty and grad worker union.
Elizabeth?
Hi, I'm Elizabeth Houseworth. I'm currently serving as chair of the Department of Statistics at Indiana University, Bloomington. I've been chair of the Department of Mathematics here. I've been president and secretary treasurer of our local AAUP chapter, and I have been a long-serving member of the Bloomington Faculty Council's Budgetary Affairs Committee. So I have served on budgetary affairs, and I've served on both the last RCM review and the current RCM budget remodeling panel locally.
Thank you. And lastly, Deb.
Hi, I'm Deb Smith. I'm a professor of philosophy at Kent State University. I'm the president of our Kent State chapter of AAUP, the faculty union here. And I'm a previous chair of our faculty senate and a longtime member of our faculty senate budget advisory committee, and also participated in a number of reviews of the RCM model as it functions here at Kent State.
Okay, thank you very much. And thank you all for joining us today. Yeah, I know a lot of you are on Eastern time, and so it's a bit late over there, but yeah, we very much appreciate your time. And so the way this panel will be structured is we're going to reserve the first 30 minutes, give or take, to I'll do a very quick introduction to RCM. I'll pose questions to our panelists, which they'll answer in turn. And so the point is to kind of get us all on the same page in terms of understanding what RCM is, but also to see the variation in RCM and how they're implemented at other universities. Yeah, I should mention that each of our four panelists, RCM has been implemented at their university. So they have very valuable insight and experience to share with us. And then after the 30 minutes, we'll do 45 minutes of Q&A. So we'll open up to anyone who's at this virtual meeting. And I think because, yeah, it's a sizable, the crowd isn't too big, that we can actually do when you during the Q&A, you could turn on your camera, you can ask questions using the mic. If you're uncomfortable with that, you can use the Q&A feature of Zoom. Okay, so if there are no questions, yeah, let's get started. So I'll do a quick introduction to RCM, Responsibility Center Management. I apologize, I'm just gonna read what I wrote. So for those of you who do not know, CSU is transitioning from its current incremental model, budget model, to a responsibility center management model, aka RCM. So we imagine there are a lot of questions, uncertainties, and anxieties about what this means for CSU, okay, for our faculty, staff, and students. So the purpose of this panel is to help demystify the RCM budget model by learning about the experiences from faculty at other universities where RCM has been implemented, okay? So RCM is a decentralized budget model where I imagine for CSU, each college is going to be a responsibility center. So what that means is each responsibility center, AKA each college, is in charge of generating its own revenue, typically from student enrollments, but also grant overhead, donor money. So, but each college is also in charge of their own costs, which I imagine primarily goes to faculty salaries and benefits. Okay, so each college is in charge of their own revenue, their own costs. The university then takes a tax off the top to fund shared indirect costs such as administration, library, and computing services. How much revenue a college gets for, let's say, each student enrolled in a class, how large the tax should be taken off the top, that's usually determined by an equation or algorithm. And based on my understanding, different universities have different levels of transparency regarding what that algorithm is. And there are also hybrid versions of RCM where the amount of decentralization varies. So you could have 100% decentralization, which I imagine is probably not implemented at any university because things like administrative centers, they do not generate their own revenue. They need to be what's the word I'm looking for? Subsidized by other responsibility centers that do generate revenue. And complete centralization is the more traditional model. So anything in between, I imagine one could call hybrid. Okay. But now I'll turn it over to the panelists so we can learn about RCM, how it's implemented at these other universities, and again, to see the variation of these RCM budget models. So my first question to you all, and we'll go in the same order that you all introduced yourself. How is RCM implemented at your university? And so let's start with Jeffrey.
Great. I forgot to mention Temple's in Philly, just for people to know where Temple University is before. The Temple has 16 colleges within it. So it is the college becomes the unit, College of Liberal Arts, or the School of Art and Architecture, or the business school, medicals. My particular bargaining unit only covers all but the medical school, the dental school, the podiatric medicine school, and the law school. And I'm pulling those out because those schools do not really have any undergraduate instruction. And at Temple, the credit hours generated, CHG, has become, over the last decade that we've had RCM, the shorthand for how we unfortunately run everything. How much CHGs are we going to generate? It impacts everything from workload and what courses get run and how hiring decision gets made. The four schools that are the professional schools really don't have the same kind of revenue. And so when the model was rolled out about a decade ago by someone who used to be at Indiana University, Noel Thibault, who then became president at Temple, there was this notion of what we call there's kind of a backfill that was put in at the beginning of to make whole the schools that don't really have the same kind of revenue coming in. That money still is there, but it hasn't been adjusted for inflation, and it's kind of this weird thing. So in terms of RCM, the tax to central for a whole lot of things is a black box that we individually have no idea how the math actually is mathing. And there are some colleges that are their tax is above 50% right now. And we don't really know. And I will tell you, like in my particular college, which is art and architecture, we had a pretty good dean running a pretty good ship. And then like last year, when there was an enrollment crisis hitting two colleges particularly hard, the College of Liberal Arts and the business school, their tax just got arbitrarily raised. And so they were now running a deficit when they didn't have a deficit. So there's a concern there for sure as well with how that has been implemented in terms of the lack of transparency about it. And then, what happens centrally, things that are supposed to be central, like, the other piece that Andrew did mention before is like building and physical plant. Some facility and infrastructure is central and paid out of that tax, but others are paid by the centers. So our building was built about 15 years ago, and we're paying that for that building in debt service out of our credit hours generated. But at the same time, we also pay to other units when we have to have classes in buildings that aren't our buildings. So I I don't know what level of hybrid that is, right? But yeah, we can get into this a little bit more. But it's kind of how Temple runs it now. What has happened in the last 10 years is that our budget committees at the collegial levels have become completely inactive. They don't really do anything other than hear from an associate dean as to what the numbers look like. And at our faculty senate, the budget committee has gone to almost nothing at all, with very little to no oversight, because the university budget doesn't really exist in the same way as it did before RCM. So there's been what had been sold as a lot of transparency has become actually far more opaque than what we had before with the centralized model.
Thank you, Jeffrey. Andrew, I can repeat the question too.
It's fine. So it's quite similar story at Rutgers. RCM was introduced by a new president, coming from ultimately from Penn in 2014. Penn being the Fons et Origo of RCM, and there are about 107 budgetary units at Rutgers. That includes both the responsibility centers, which are schools, which is to say things like the School of Arts and Sciences, the School of Engineering, and this includes all three campuses of Rutgers. Rutgers University is kind of one organizational unit that covers all three of the State University of New Jersey campuses. And then the cost centers would be things like the Office of the President, the libraries, facilities, IT, and so on. And I'll dilate later about the sort of disastrous outcomes. But yeah, it's a similar picture. We have no idea what formulas are used to determine the size of the so-called cost pool transfer. Once our faculty activists like me started making a lot of noise about that, the main response was to change the name of the cost pool transfer to the facilities and administrative allocation. But it's still just a tax. It's about 700 million out of the 5.3 billion in revenue at Rutgers. It goes up to central in the tax. And in general, the pattern at Rutgers is that it wipes out any surplus at the unit level. So though the idea of RCM in the manuals for it was to let units keep surpluses if they had a surplus from tuition and other revenue, in effect, all of that is hoovered up by the central administration through the cost pool. I'm sorry, the facilities and administrative expense mechanism. And that's kind of where we are now, 10 years on. And I'll talk later about, kind of some assessments that's been done, but that's the story.
Okay, Indiana University is one of the very earliest adopters of RCM. Locally, there was a mathematician involved, and the initial model was a model only a mathematician could love. It was a great big matrix model with so many drivers that nobody could predict it. Around a while back, 15 years ago or so, it became very simple. It basically blends the out-of-state and in-state tuition, and every school gets $450 per credit hour. So the Kelly School of Business has mainly out-of-state students, lots and lots of out-of-state students. The College of Arts and Sciences mainly has in-state students. Everyone gets $450 per credit hour. The tax is also straightforward. You're taxed on four things. You're taxed on the credit hours, you're taxed on the space that you use, you're taxed on faculty, and you're taxed on staff at slightly different rates. The numbers in front of those can be known, but what I found out at the last review was that they're determined by figuring out what the campus needs. And then they're reverse engineered to make sure that campus gets what campus needs. But once you know the numbers, a school it could predict pretty well. There was also a tax for the university administration, so the president's level, not the campus level, but the university level here. And those taxes are used to support the support units, like we heard, the president's office that doesn't generate money, libraries, and so forth. Now, we used to really operate under a fairly pure RCM, but that return to the schools has been $450 per credit hour for over 10 years now. And what has happened is that secretly the center has kept any increase in revenue. And the president has used it to probably fund his grand challenges. And the provost has used it to fund hiring at the, with the provost's control rather than the dean's control. And all of this has been under the belt. So all the faculty have been told that we basically have pure RCM and all this money is coming from miraculous sources. But the miraculous sources is the fact that we haven't really been RCM for at least the past 10 years. RCM can, at some institutions, be pushed down to the departmental level. I believe at IUPUI, it has been pushed down to the department level. That fails completely. If you don't, a department is just too variable to, you need something, a larger conglomerate to deal with the ups and downs. Today, we're undergoing a revision of our budgeting process, and participants are at odds over what they thought they heard the provost say. I think I heard the provost say that he would prefer to have a more incremental system. One good change that they're trying to implement, I believe they're actually trying, is to make those administrative units live within their budget. So they're going to take off the top a certain percentage and give it to the university administration. But when we reach the enrollment cliff and enrollment goes down, the university administration is going to have to learn how to cut, just like all the schools have learned how to cut. And presumably the same thing is going to happen at the campus model. So it's really the campus where RCM has been implemented. Indiana University has several campuses. It's done differently on each campus. There was a tax for university administration and a tax for the campus. And it's really the campus that rebudgeting, reformulation budget model that whose committee I'm on right now.
All right, at Kent State, we've been on RCM since 2008. The colleges are the responsibility centers. I should also say it's really only for the Kent campus, which is by far our largest campus. We have 7 smaller regional campuses, and they've always been on something. They've always had their own independent budgets and kicked a fee back to the main campus for various things, but it's considered separate from the RCM model here. The revenue for each of the colleges is based basically on their share of the full-time enrollment tuition. So it captures out-of-state, in-state already, and the share of state subsidy. Any fundraising is separate. It goes to our foundation, so it doesn't really play a part in the RCM model at all. We then pay a tax. I think when we started, it was around 47%. It's a flat tax. All colleges pay it. It then crept up secretly because they were funding scholarships to where it was above 52%. And then we worked to with Faculty Senate to get it down back to right currently it's at 48%. We've been actually tracking the budget for the central units that are run by the vice presidents to make sure they're not growing these huge fund balances. So they actually are making cuts when we have to make cuts, so that they are doing their fair share. One sort of difference in terms of how the money is spent to the different colleges is that when we implemented RCM, everyone understood that the College of Arts and Sciences was primarily responsible for running the gen ed courses. And so the problem was that the revenue tracked the majors, and that meant that arts and sciences would have all of the expenses connected to running those classes, but the other colleges would get the revenue. And so we implemented what we called the 80-20 split, which meant that the college that was hosting the class got 80%, and then the remaining 20 went to the college whose major the student was. We keep rethinking whether that's the right amount, but that was the amount decided that would come closest to keeping where we were right before RCM. One of the things that we do see is that some of the colleges, like how the dean itself distributes the money to the independent departments and schools within a college, where we have some colleges that don't have departments and schools, but the ones that do, that's up to the dean, and some deans handle it better. Deans that handle it in a more centralized way and realize that not all departments can be expected to make money or even break even, those things work well. A good example here is like the School of Music here. We have a very good School of Music. It actually gets a lot of donor money, but it could never be expected to break even because there needs to be individualized instrument training. And of course, you can't just take like a woodwind instructor and plug and play them into a string class, right? So they're so very specialized. But we do have deans that try to push it down to the department and college level. That is absolutely disastrous. And often when that happens, the chair or director of the department or school then tries to push it down even on the individual faculty level, wanting to make sure that the faculty are sort of serving enough students to pay for their individual salary and benefits. And perhaps ironically, that works a lot worse for faculty that are top researchers, work with graduate students, et cetera, because they just don't serve as many students. So that's always a disaster. We're not entirely a pure RCM. I think on paper, we're supposed to be a pure RCM. They don't consider us hybrid. But for example, the College of Arts and Sciences is routinely $8 to $10 million in the red every year. The way RCM is supposed to work, they would actually have to cut and get rid of programs and whatnot to get in budget. But the College of Arts and Sciences brings in well over 80% of the federal grant-funded research. They're wholly responsible for not wholly, but largely responsible for our R1 research status. So the upper administration just sort of looks the other way and fills in that red somewhere. I don't know exactly where the money comes from. And to date, I think Arts and Sciences has a like negative $80 million fund balance, whatever that means. We will never be asked to pay it. So.
Okay, interesting. Yeah, thank you. So our second and final question before we open it up to everyone for a Q&A is, and we already heard some of this, but what are the consequences of RCM on pedagogy and research at your university? So yeah, let's go in the same order, Jeffrey.
Yeah, so I mean, a lot of this that I was kind of mapping out, folks already hinted at, and so just to kind of go through a few things fairly quickly, the gen ed issue is huge for us too. We don't have an 80-20 thing. The fact is that every undergrad at Temple University has to take general education course, the bulk of which are in our College of Liberal Arts. Every undergraduate has to take 2 semesters of a program called Intellectual Heritage. Those are all taught within the College of Liberal Arts. Number of majors in anthropology and sociology might be down, right? So CLA's budget in the last couple of years, because budget's based on CHGs and numbers of majors, has been a real issue. And we don't have the ability to run the $8 million in the red thing that Deborah was talking about. And so what has happened is massive cuts to well-qualified faculty. Since 2017, there's been a 41% reduction in tenure lines or tenure and tenure track faculty at Temple. We've also seen a reduction overall of the professorate, because if we include full-time non-tenure track faculty, it's still a 30% decline in the number of faculty, full-time faculty. Our adjunct number has kind of been about flat. But adjuncts who had been teaching 2 classes a semester are now teaching 1 class a semester, and in many cases, going from teaching 2 classes of 20 to 1 class of 40. So workload is another real issue that has crept into this. And again, this is not, I can't blame all of it on RCM. This is the adjunctification of higher ed that we've all been unfortunately seeing, but like it's not helping, right? To have one college pit itself against each other, sometimes to chase the same number of students for those courses. It has led a lot of colleges to say, wait a second, we need to generate revenue. We do that through credit hours. Let's add a whole bunch of gen ed courses on the books. And I will tell you that like my particular little department we have a ton of gen ed courses that have 400 or 500 students a semester in the multiple sections that floats the rest of what we do, because otherwise the balance wouldn't quite work out. And I don't know if pedagogically that's the right thing. It is a good course to introduce folks possibly into majors. The course itself is a good class, right? It's not a bad thing to be teaching, but we definitely think about what we offer. It means fewer electives might be offered, right? As opposed to courses that are popular, that get good enrollments. It becomes very difficult for us to run courses that by need have to be small numbers. Musical instruction, studio arts, some of those things where you don't want large ratios. The pressure is to increase the course caps, especially amongst your tenured faculty, who are oftentimes research active and teaching those graduate seminars. Those courses can't run with 30 people and still do what they need to do, right? And that's a concern that we've certainly seen as well. There's also, because of the kind of black box of the tax, the other thing I just want to throw out there and let others jump in too is this admin bloat has happened. Since we've had RCM, we've seen huge numbers and increases in like if you look at the publicly published budget documents, it's hate to say it, it's HR and athletics. Like those are the 2 centers that are kind of central, right? That have seen growth at a time when, like I said, we're down 41% on tenure and tenure track lines. And so that really changes the nature of the university, right? In terms of how we think about interdisciplinarity and collaboration with colleagues, at a time that students want to see and take those kinds of courses. Researchers, we want to do those kinds of projects with colleagues that are adjacent or even completely unrelated to our disciplines. The spaces for that collaboration, unless you've got a grant that's paying for it, the spaces for those collaborations, unless they happen within your college, within your budget center, right? It becomes really hard for me to talk to a colleague in College of Public Health who does social work, in neighborhood setting, and my work on community and economic development, right? So I think those are spaces that I think are of concern for sure, that I would just want to highlight.
Andrew?
If I can, I have a couple of slides, just so I'm going to read out some quotes, and I thought I would show them if that's going to work. Let's see if it works. Otherwise, oh, I see. Okay, host says I can't. That's okay. I can do it old school here. Right, RCM came in at Rutgers 2014. There was a very difficult year for administrative staff when the old system and the new system were running on top of each other. There was a shadow budget year. But anyway, then, so we've had 10 years of RCM. And in 2021, a kind of blue ribbon committee of senior administrators completed a review of RCM at Rutgers, which makes really edifying reading. Let me see, I meant to give you the link to it. Let's see if I can bring that up quickly here. Here. It's so good. It's really, okay. And what they concluded was that broad conclusions. It wasn't good for the public mission of the university. Here's what they wrote. The committee identified areas where the design of the current budget model appears to discourage desired behaviors or impede mission critical programs and initiatives, including those that relate to PhD education. Oh, that. Arts and humanities. Diversity, equity, and inclusion. And those that support students. Oops. Or further the university's public mission. Oh, just those things, but the rest is fine. Actually, no, because it turned out that for sponsored research, it wasn't working well either. The absence, says the committee, the absence of an established process to determine the distribution of F&A recovery and the assignment of charges leads to ad hoc solutions that take time and result in inconsistent outcomes. So that's no good. Well, maybe it's good for what it's supposed to be good for, which is, getting everybody to squeeze the last dollar out of their activities. The committee, writes this blue ribbon panel, found that the design of the current budget model and the metrics used appear to encourage behaviors that favor revenue generation over other contributions, disadvantaging many non or low revenue generating units that play a critical role in the university's public mission. And just as an aside, we had the same time that we had a new president bringing in RCM, we had a new dean of arts and sciences who was hired off from Ohio State, where they'd had ICM. And he came around to our department and all the departments in arts and sciences. And he said, well, you're going to have to put your business glasses on for RCM and, just really take a cold look at the cross subsidies. And, that never happened. I mean, first of all our backs were put up because of the business glasses thing, but more to the point, it was just not true that we ever saw where the cross subsidies were. No one has any idea. And as for this financial revenue generation thing, this blue ribbon panel surveyed all the administrators, and they asked them how many agreed with the statement, the RCM model helps me meet the financial goals of my unit. Less than 1 in 3 respondents agreed to some extent with the statement that the RCM model helps meet the financial goals of their unit, with only 4% of all respondents totally agreeing with that statement. So this really blew my mind when we saw this. I mean, we knew faculty hated it, but administrators hate it. Nobody thinks it does at Rutgers. Nobody thinks it does what it's supposed to do. Everybody thinks that it runs counter to the mission. And now it's locked in, though. As Jeffrey said, there's this kind of blow up of administrators and sub-administrators who are responsible for managing the increased complexity of this model. And they're there. They're not going anywhere. They're just going to be there. So it's really been an unfortunate process at Rutgers, where a big performance of transparency and accountability has really meant a decrease in the accountability at the center, and a lot of distractions and complexities. Just to get a little specific about things that I think have really been persistent problems with RCM at Rutgers, we never see the actuals that correspond to the budgets. So they publish these unit budgets, all 107 units, but the actuals, the state requires Rutgers to publish actuals, but only at the campus level. So that's where the information about cross subsidies might have been visible, but is not. Nor is the allocation of the strategic funds. So whatever is supposed to, the theory of RCM is that strategic funds will fill in the gaps, will catch up. If there are units like arts that can never pay for themselves, then it's the job of those on Olympus to provide for them. But that's been completely buried at Rutgers. We have no information about how strategic funds are gathered or spent, and we have no information about how reserves are used. Even though in financial reports, we see that unrestricted reserves have grown enormously. Now they're at $1 billion. They were at, they've grown from about 600 million in the last 6-7 years. There's been an enormous growth in the surplus, and it seems that management has used RCM to pursue a goal of sequestering that surplus from the academic core. And that's kind of where we're at Rutgers now.
At Indiana University, there's never been a component that's been majors. So we get money based on credit hours. So what that does is it makes everyone want to teach as many students as possible with the cheapest labor possible, using the least space possible for their program, because our drivers are so simple these days. The one effect of that was that when we remodeled Gen Ed, we could not say that the college owned Gen Ed, because to get cooperation from all the schools, we had to let every school participate in general education. RCM has also caused other problems. My graduate students in the college have had to fight to take courses in computer science because computer science is in a different school. Fee remissions are funny money that colleges pay to themselves, but they become very real when that graduate student needs to take a course in another school and that money transfers to a different school. So this causes difficulties with graduate students getting the training that they need. The Kelley School of Business here offers its own business writing course. This happened long ago and was done despite the college having plenty of experts in writing. When the Department of Statistics was formed, there was no hope of consolidated dating statistics teaching in the Department of Statistics because it's a money-making revenue thing for everybody and nobody would have wanted to give it up. Each school in turn here has been in some kind of revenue crisis. Every time this happens, it causes a lot of work with the school needing to meet with the provost and the provost financial office in order to come up with some short-term solution and long-term fixes to their problems. Support units have grown disproportionately, so the taxes have increased disproportionately. And the schools haven't had any collective way of fighting that. Some say RCM does not hinder interdisciplinary research, but I strongly believe it does. The dean, there's a claim that basically it's people that are hindering it, not RCM. But you get deans who are competitive with each other, and the revenue is better in-house than shared, and they can't come up with any cooperative solution. So I believe that it strongly hinders interdisciplinary work, and my example of graduate students interdisciplinary training is an example of that. Proactively, it sometimes does work. A dean is motivated to find additional sources of revenue if they believe that they can keep that additional source of revenue. So some schools have been doing well creating fee-paying master's programs because that is revenue that the school gets to keep. Long ago, Kelley created a brilliant online MBA program that is done fantastically and has earned our business school a great deal of money. So sometimes it can, in fact, be motivating to the deans like it's supposed to be.
All right. So at Kent State, I think I mentioned we have a budget subcommittee of faculty senate that's called FASBAC. And this committee meets 4 times an academic year, and we receive financial data, including both budget and actuals, from both university level wide and individual colleges and the central divisions that are funded by the tax. We get data on enrollment trends and things like that. So we have a ton of data to work with, and we get this routinely, and they've been very open about giving us whatever data that we actually ask for. So I think Kent State is a best practice when it comes to faculty consultation with respect to the budget, but I don't think this is a creature of RCM. I think this is a creature of our administration and their commitment to faculty governance, because they could do this on any budget model. part of the charge of FASBAC is to periodically evaluate the effects of RCM, both on our academic mission and to reassess the sort of functionality of the RCM formula itself that we use. And I've been on several of these subcommittees that have made recommendations in the past. Among the things that these committees have found, there's definitely been pressure to increase course cap maximums and to cancel low enrolled courses. But we didn't find any evidence of grade inflation. We actually expected to, because in Ohio, the state has us on a state funding model that looks at number of students who pass with a D or better, whatever. And so we suspected that there would be pressure for grade inflation. But when we looked at the pre-RCM years versus the RCM years, we didn't see any evidence for that. And I think some of the pressure on the enrollment side of things would have been there regardless, again, of RCM, but RCM doesn't help at all. There was no evidence that the number of sabbaticals had dropped. That was something we were worried about, but we saw no evidence of that. The ratio of non-tenure track faculty to tenure track faculty has steadily grown, but it started growing before we went on RCM. It looked like the trend there was just sort of consistent and was not impacted by RCM. Where we see the problem is that there are greater budgetary challenges to colleges that have significant numbers of graduate programs and research-heavy missions because they teach smaller classes and have sort of fewer students compared to the number of faculty there. It's been hard getting some of the deans and the other colleges to understand that research actually costs money in terms of the startup costs you have to give to the faculty, et cetera. It's not a money maker, it costs money. And so one of the things one of our RCM committees recommended was that we actually build into the formula for RCM a research component. So it wasn't just butts and seats, as our president used to say. And this recommendation hasn't been acted upon yet, but it has gone all the way up to the president, the provost, and the CFO. And they are required to either do it or tell us why they're not. So we're waiting to hear about that. Couple of things that don't so much come from the findings of these committees, but just come from my own sense of working on these budget committees and seeing what I see just as the president of the union. I will echo what some of my colleagues have said here. It definitely makes interdisciplinary programs, especially those that cross colleges, much, much harder to implement. And it makes it harder to have any sorts of change in general education requirement, because those gen ed courses are like gold in an RCM environment, and everybody wants one and nobody wants to lose one. And so you start making these what should be pedagogical decisions. What's in the best interest of our students? What should all of our students know when they graduate from here now about the budget, which is a problematic thing. It's created duplication of professionals. I would call this administrative bloat, but it's not the kind of administrator that we normally think of. I mean, we normally think of like deans and deanlets and associate provostlets and VPs and things like that when we talk about administrative bloat. But we've had a huge bloat in professional advisors for students, in financial advisors, in IT and whatnot, because now each college has their own little set of these. And it would actually be much more efficient to have this centralized and figure out how many professional advisors do we need to serve the student population in general. We could probably have a lot of savings there. And right now, as the university is contracting with the enrollment shrinking, we're looking at the demographic cliff. And in Ohio, the state budget model is set up in such a way that if you aren't growing, inflation is always going to outpace the revenue you can generate. So it's creating some challenges to all of the state schools here in Ohio. And so it would be a challenge no matter what in this environment, but RCM really complicates it because everybody's in their little budgetary silo. And although the university has been very transparent with the university-wide data with the faculty bodies, I don't think they're always transparent that way with the deans. So the deans only see the budget numbers in their little college. They don't see everything else, or don't have the university-wide perspective. And so it's very easy for a dean to go, I don't know why I'm being asked to make cuts because we're in the black and we have this fund balance. And really what we need right now is we're all in it together. We need to be thinking about the greater good. What does the university need? And it certainly isn't going to help a tiny little college. Like, just for example, our tiny little College of Nursing is actually doing quite well under RCM. They wouldn't be able to survive if arts and science had to undergo retrenchment and we lost our R1 status. I mean, the whole university would tank. It's ridiculous to think that they're independent in that way. But RCM really, it motivates that kind of independent siloed thinking, which is annoying when finances are fine at the university level, and is almost an existential threat when things are tough at the university. So that's what I feel here.
Okay, great. Thanks, everyone. Andrew, you have your hand up. Yeah, do you want to add
Just want
something?
to jump in with one remark. So I think both Elizabeth and Deb have mentioned the so-called enrollment or demographic cliff. I just want to sound a note of skepticism about that. You know, obviously it depends on the context, you know, what state, in other words. And
Yeah.
but you know, I find it very instructive to look at the Department of Education's projections, which I'll just leave for you here. You know, we've just been thinking about this in our union finance and budget committee, and you know, because our administration loves to say, oh no, you know, all the students are going to go away and we'll never have any tuition revenues, so we better cut you all the bone. But you know, yeah, it's going to level off. It's not going to grow in New Jersey. Things look frightening in some states, but the national picture is quite positive. And I think Colorado in particular, you don't have to worry for the moment.
Yeah. Ohio is one of the not so happy states.
Is one of the scary spots.
It's actually coming. We see it. We saw it when they entered kindergarten. We see them coming up, and now they're like juniors in high school. And it's a huge. We have public high schools here that have lost 40% of their enrollments, and so that's at the public high school. So it's very real, and it's coming in Ohio. I think also in parts of Pennsylvania and Indiana.
Yeah, I mean, and again, it's also something that, not for nothing, but like this is something that because I teach demography as part of what I do, like this is not news. This is not COVID only, right? This is not a oh my God, all of a sudden. It is something that has been known for a long time, and a failure to plan for it does not constitute an emergency today. And this is where like RCM, I think, has been a hard thing, because strategic investment in things that is university wide that may impact different colleges differently, those are really hard choices to make unless you take all the tax money away from the you know, on the revenue side. So like, yeah, Pennsylvania is one of those states where we're gonna have a problem, but like there's two solutions there. One is raise your national reputation and get students from not just your region. And two, 18 to 25-year-olds are not the only people who are looking at higher ed, and can we please actually have an honest to goodness conversation about different kinds of students, right? And like, but RCM sometimes gets in the way of having those strategic conversations, because then how do you make long-term investments ahead of revenue coming in, right? Unless you've got a pot of money you're sitting on, unless you've got an endowment, unless you've got a reserve fund, how do you spend $100 million over the next 3 years, knowing that the revenue is not going to come for 4 or 5? Like, those are decisions that used to just be made centrally because you'd ride out the storm, and at an RCM level becomes really hard. And we are like very much, you know, responsible for doing like recruitment and admissions stuff that obviously we've always done at the program and college level for graduate students, but it's really being pushed. You know, we're trying to chase down students as undergrads, and that's like, again, I think this is somewhat RCM, you know, impacted.
I will say that one thing that I think is actually a good thing that Kent State is doing in the face of the declining domestic enrollment is we are reaching out and making relationships internationally. So I know our provost has been traveling all over. She's in Cambodia and Vietnam this week, trying to make relationships with universities there. She was in Rwanda last year. We have a relationship with a university in Brazil where we send our instructors down, and then their juniors and seniors come to Kent State. So I mean, I think that we're trying to backfill. I don't know if that's quite the right word. The dip in the domestic enrollment with international enrollment, and they're having quite a lot of success, and I think it's going to make a really exciting, vibrant international campus as it comes to fruition. But I don't think that that's necessarily connected to RCM. I think that's just connected. RCM just tells you how you divide up the existing pie among the people. It doesn't necessarily tell you how to grow the pie. And that's one of the things that's become a problem, that when the pie is shrinking, you need all eyes on the problem and not just everybody looking at their own little piece of the pie and worrying about, oh, if we do this, then somebody else is going to get more of the pie or whatever. It makes it harder to do sort of crisis budgeting, and we're not in a crisis yet, but we're we have seen it coming. Our CFO has planned for it. It is a challenge, and RCM is making it harder to rise to that challenge rather than making it easier to do so.
Okay, thank you. This has been very fascinating, but I want to open it up to anyone who's attending this virtual panel. If you have specific questions, anything you're curious about or worried about. And so we have different ways we can do this. So you could write your question directly in the Q&A function, and Mary Van Buren is in charge of that and can relay those questions. I already saw some questions in the chat, so I can go through those. But you can also turn on your camera, unmute yourself, ask a question directly if you'd like. Or I can start. So I saw Gretchen wrote something in the chat, and I think, well, a lot of you touched upon this already, but if you could give some more details about how RCM can, or I guess evidence shows does, pit colleges against each other, fighting for, yeah, these gen ed courses, fighting for butts and seats. Yeah, if someone can comment more on that.
I think gen ed may be the easiest way to explain this. Every college at Temple has felt the need to add gen ed courses over the last decade. Yes, most of them live within our College of Liberal Arts, just because it's also like 23% of our faculty are in CLA in terms of just, you know, but regardless of that, everyone wants gen ed courses. Everyone wants to offer them as many seats as possible. And the holy grail of doing this is get yourself a gen ed course that is asynchronous online, so that you can, regardless of pedagogically, that's the right way to do that material. Because not only can you find an instructor that you don't have to necessarily bring to campus and give an office and support in the same way, you also don't have to have a room to put the class in. And so your facilities piece of it goes away. And yeah, we learned during shutdown a few years ago, we're coming up on the 4th anniversary here, like we learned which materials we can do well online. We've learned how to do this, and we also learned which ones, yeah, really we should not be doing that remotely if at all possible. But you know, I have this gen ed course that you know, we realized, yeah, this thing works online, right? We didn't think about it. It works actually better. So we just keep adding sections. Now, which means we're just hiring more adjuncts, and the incentive here is to contribute to the contingency, in addition to us trying to compete against the same 29,000 undergraduates who have to take these courses at some point anyway. We try to make a good one, right? And not necessarily, you know, and I've seen this at Temple where people will add new courses, and we're supposed to have a centralized system that checks for redundancy, you know, and duplicate, but it doesn't work because people don't pay attention to it. And you know, this is the race to the bottom, right? Of us all chasing the same pool of students, and it does mean competition.
Mary, yeah, do you want to relay a question from the Q&A?
Actually, I had my own question, if that's okay. I just wondered, given what all you guys are saying about the consequences, especially, for instance, at Rutgers and the Rutgers report, what is the motivation for central administration to get onto this particular boat? Are they being misled about what the advantages are, or do you think, some other kind of motivation for doing it?
I have some thoughts about that's a great question. I mean, I think it would take sociologist organizations to look at how this model has kind of spread. And I do think there's a bit of, what they call isomorphism going on, where one institution does it and it's kind of spread because everyone does it and no one knows too well what to do, so might as well do what someone else does. There's a minor cottage industry of consultants who shop it. It's kind of house product of NACUBO, the National Association of College and University Business Officers. So I think there is a bit of that going on. But at Rutgers, it clearly has increased or it seems to me it increased the latitude and discretion at the very top, at the expense of the levels further down, including the deans. And so that seems, like the kind of thing an executive might be interested in. But it doesn't really benefit anybody else. Yeah, I don't think anybody's ever seen any evidence that it actually causes everybody to supercharge their revenue generation. So far as I know, no one's ever given a convincing case for that.
I think that Indiana really believes that. They also believe that it helps recruit better deans. If you give people power over something, then they feel more ownership. And I think that the local sentiment is that that I'm not saying there's strong evidence for this necessarily, but I think that the idea is that you will get better deans. In fact, a colleague who had wanted to be a dean said he would never be a dean somewhere where there wasn't RCM because he wanted the control. Now, I'm not even saying I would recommend that colleague for a dean. When I wanted to be a dean, I didn't care about RCM actually, but there's an idea that it attracts better leadership.
I will echo that. And I know that, at Kent State right now, there's a lot of the Faculty Budget Advisory Committee would very much like to recommend that we go off of RCM. I know that our CFO would like to go off of RCM because he does see that the silo budgeting is creating, a hardship right now. But what we're hearing is that the now president, who was the provost when a lot of our deans were hired, he promised them, he brought them in on the promise of RCM and all this autonomy. And so he's very concerned that it would look A, like a bait and switch, or B, like, even if it wasn't a bait and switch, even if they understood that circumstances really had changed and that there was a reason to now contemplate going off of it. He's worried, I think, that some of them would leave to places where they had more autonomy. And I agree with Elizabeth. I don't know how much evidence there is for that, but I think that is part of the sentiment.
Just one last thought there, and I know we've got at least another hand up, that is that when RCM was introduced at Temple a decade or more ago, the biggest selling point was around the notion of transparency. No longer will budgets be this centralized black box that nobody knows about. If you do RCM pure and correct, every single person in the university committee should have access to all of the budget information all across the board at all times. Like that's the promise of RCM. And so if you're talking to a board of chancellors, a board of trustees, even elected leadership, depending on how your state's public eds are structured, the notion of transparency, the notion of moving into the light, so to speak, like the myths of how higher ed functions, it has a compelling ring to it in a neoliberal world. And so I definitely got a lot of people at Temple on board who were reluctant to the whole thing, and worried about backfills and not being made whole, and we invented this subvention thing. But like the transparency argument is really powerful, I think, to a lot of folks, in addition to everything about deans and all the stuff that other folks have been saying.
It just doesn't always work out. it's not always nearly as transparent as they claim it is.
And there's also no reason you couldn't do any budget model in a transparent way.
Michelle.
Yeah, I just, first of all, I want to thank everyone. This is an amazing panel because hearing about the different experiences is so instructive. I was really struck by what Deborah said about how much data they were getting, which I don't think happens anywhere. Elizabeth, the detail that you gave. I'm pretty familiar with the stuff Andrew went over, but it's always good to hear it from Andrew. But I think I was struck by Jeff in particular and the dystopian picture that you painted at Temple, and it's hard to hear that, this kind of Walmartization, like let's just offer these giant courses as cheaply as we can. But you also mentioned getting rid of a lot of tenured faculty, and that may be the end game here, because that, and I know, from Andrew's amazing work, actually, he didn't talk about it yet, Andrew Goldstone, but at Rutgers, we've been a tenure track, and tenure is flat, but NTT, people on contracts, full-time untenured, is really sort of replacing. And so once that happens, then the administration has full control of the university, right? And so I guess my question to you, Jeff, is like, is this in the cultural DNA at Temple, is to sort of, go along with this kind of like, lowest cost model? You're in a very, I'll stop talking in a second, but you're in a very competitive market where you are. You've got a lot of schools right around you, including Rutgers. Are you not hollowing out the school? Are people not pushing back on losing so many tenured faculty in the name of saving money? You're constantly in financial crisis. I mean, what is the culture like there? And is there no pushback to defend, the core of the school?
So I'd love for you to come and just talk to our provost. No, we've been fighting back against RCM since the beginning. Unfortunately, Temple is in a weird spot. We're a public school, but we are what we call what's called a state related. And I don't want to go too far down this particular path, but we have a board of trustees and we have a fair amount of local control. So unlike Rutgers, which is a state system with multiple campuses, or Indiana, we don't have the complexity of, say, the SUNY system in New York or the UC system in California. And so there's like 3 tiers of public school in Pennsylvania. You've got the community colleges, which are supposed to be funded a third between the county that they're in, tuition and state revenue. You have the Pennsylvania state system of higher ed, which are kind of the public schools, 4-year schools. Some of them are R1s, but a lot of them are R2s, that have had lots of problems, and they have a centralized chancellor, and anything to do anything comes out of the Capitol, comes out of Harrisburg, kind of stuff. And right now, Governor Josh Shapiro is proposing a really scary, massive restructuring of the community college and the PASHE system. That's what we call Pennsylvania State System, PASHE. And then you've got these 4 other schools that are the really big dogs in terms of enrollment, but we have our own, where we get a percentage of our money comes from appropriations, but it's not at all the totality of our budget. We're still very revenue dependent on tuition. So the 4 schools are Pitt, Penn State, Temple, and Lincoln, which is an HBCU, not quite an hour outside of Philadelphia, west of Philly. And Lincoln's a much smaller school than the other 3. And so Temple has local control and a board of trustees that appoints its own members. Only a handful of them are public appointees. Majority of them are very much coming out of like what you'd expect to see at a private college. And like the chair of the board, this guy named Mitch Morgan, is a real estate developer. And so for him, RCM is great, right? It's transparent, it's responsible, it's got responsibility built into the name. And we're at the bargaining table right now trying some sense of job security for contingent faculty, as well as raises for folks. And the line that just keeps coming back from admin is about the need for flexibility, which again is a very corporate-y kind of perspective on it, and it fits with this RCM model. So when we finally got the data recently that shows this 41% decline since 2017 in tenure and tenure track faculty, our tenured faculty didn't realize the extent of the decline, right? We sent a letter to all the deans. I sent a letter to head of the union, sent a letter to all the deans saying, do you realize that the right sizing and the flexibility that's being talked about has already happened? We are now so far down where we need to be, right? And we're starting to get some folks to stand up and say no, but our faculty senate has been fairly co-opted, unfortunately, in the last few years from becoming nothing more than an arm of administration to come in and make presentations a few times a year. And it's, shared governance is a real problem right now. We've got a lot of activist faculty, but most of that space is happening within the union and not within other spaces of faculty governance. And because of like the quirk of Pennsylvania law, department chairs aren't in our bargaining unit, and we have a separate union for our grad students. And so it is fractured. That said, I love Temple and I've been teaching that for 20 years and I wouldn't go anywhere else, right? Like it's a great school and we have some great students, but like the faculty are really getting concerned. And what has happened, it hasn't been a slash and burn. They haven't invoked retrenchment because they don't have to. They've just let retirements or lack of support for research mean junior faculty stick around for 3 years and they go find another job on the tenure job someplace else. That's kind of come together. A lot of folks didn't do COVID well and like decided to retire, after those several really, really bad years, and our ranks are down. And then we put a provision in our collective bargaining agreement last time that non-tenure track full-time faculty, of which I'm one, just to put it out there, would have to get multi-year contracts. If they'd been there for 6 years or more, they have to get a 3-year contract. They have, the language we didn't put in was strong enough because last year they just non-renewed 19 NCTs and another 50 of them were given 1-year contracts and the only explanation given was budget uncertainties or enrollment uncertainties and stuff like that. I mean, we're in court, right? I mean, we've grieved and we're arbitrating stuff. Like there's other processes going on, but what's happening right now is that out of about 600 NTTs, 286 of them are up for renewal this year because of these 1-year contracts and folks who are up for regular renewal. That is a huge number of contract faculty. And what's going to happen is that we've got a real problem. Like if you add all the adjuncts and the full-time NTTs, 55% of my bargaining unit doesn't know they have a job on July 1. Like that's what happens when RCM gets on steroids, when you've got all of this kind of pro-business folks running a public school, right? And by the way, Pennsylvania's 49th in the country in terms of funding for higher ed, right? So there's all that was mentioned in the chat about state funding as being a real issue. So, these factors all kind of come together, and we're not happy about it, but which is why when Andrew reached out and said, hey, you want to talk about our CM, I shoot his ears off for an hour, but like there's a lot going on, but we don't want this to be the way it is.
The deans, there's some deans around here who've been not exactly joking, but have been making comments like they need to do away with tenure so that they can gain more flexibility. Ironically, well, I was in a meeting with one of the deans who did this, but it's a dean of a school where the faculty are relatively underpaid. The business school doesn't have this problem because the faculty are extremely well paid. So whenever they ask a faculty member to do something, they will do it. The lecturers are paid double what they're paid in the College of Arts and Sciences, and the tenure track faculty are paid double. But around here, there is some tenure track faculty just general slowdown because the raises have been so low. And this causes some kind of backlash with lack of support for tenure among the administration.
I wanted to say a little bit about the non-tenure track full-time non-tenure track faculty at Kent State. We're really unique here because they actually have their own bargaining unit. So AAUP-CSU is the chapter, and we have 2 bargaining units, one for the tenure track faculty and one for the NTTs. And they have bargained over the years, and even during the RCM years, something that is, I almost want to call quasi tenure, so that although they technically are on 1-year contracts, by the time you've gone through 3-year renewals, you have much more flexibility. There becomes harder and harder for them to non-renew you. And by the time you've been around 9 years, the only conditions in which they could non-renew you are pretty much the same conditions in which they could let go of a tenured faculty member. So I think that they've given themselves a lot of good job security. They're definitely not quite as secure in the retrenchment situation as the tenure track faculty are, but just only one step down from that. They've done a good job there. I think the reason that we're seeing a lot more growth in NTTs relative to TTs is, though, because they have a different workload. They're generally on a 4-4 load, or excuse me, a 5-5 load, where for tenure track, it would be 4-4, but those of us who also do research get offloads for research and working with graduate programs and whatnot. So just even if you had the same salary for a TT and an NTT, you could get more teaching out of an NTT, and there's that advantage. The other thing that caused a lot of growth in the NTTs was actually a really good thing, and that was right around the time that the ACA came in, when the university realized that there were now going to be issues about having to give healthcare benefits to people who are teaching a certain amount. A lot of universities just sort of chopped the hours of adjuncts, got more adjuncts, but chopped the hours so that they didn't have to give benefits. At Kent State, they elevated a lot of adjuncts into full-time NTTs and gave them benefits. And so that was a good thing. So I just wanted to throw that out there.
Okay, thank you, everyone. So we're at time. So I want to thank everyone in the audience for coming and attending and listening, and hopefully it was informative and useful. I want everyone to give a round of applause to our panelists. I thought this was wonderfully informative. Yeah, great panel. And I just want to finish with, if we as faculty, and I see there's at least one grad student here, if we want more transparency from our administration and for them to not make decisions unilaterally, then we have to organize, and we need numbers, right? And so this is my shameless plug for everyone to join CSU AAUP, or if you're a grad student, UCW. But yeah, definitely organize. Yeah, there we go. Yeah, solidarity. Okay, well, thank you, and have a good evening, everybody.
Thank you.
Thanks so much.
Thank you so much, panelists. That was really great.
Pleasure.